Yeah.
Welcome.
There you go, Ty.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to our second class in our more in-depth glimpse at programming. I'm going to turn this over. First of all, I'm going to thank our sponsor, CDW, for helping out with these classes and with their generous funding support. And I'm going to turn it over to Florian Beijers to help us out again today with our advanced coding. I think we're going to be doing some Python today.
Speech mode off.
You're getting better at that name every day. I love it. It's fantastic. All right. Yeah, Python today. We're doing Python. We're doing the snake, as it was referred to earlier as a little pre-setup here. Now, as for what pre-knowledge you need for this one, essentially you need, if possible, having seen the third lecture would have been good, because we covered some Python in that lecture. And I think also a little bit. And the second one was mostly Visual Studio Code. Now, I'm using Visual Studio Code for this demonstration, but we're not going super deep into it. Like, it's there, but we're not really super using a lot of it. So at times it'll pop up with quick suggestions, and well, yeah, that's pretty much it. Before I do that, I'm going to cover the homework that we did last week. That was pretty fun. It was like an Arya, fied, as it were, webpage that we did in lecture 4. So last week we covered a whole bunch of Arya, and then we did a bunch of why is Arya more important than ever now? What's this whole JavaScript thing? Why is it like more and more componentized? What are all these things that are happening? And why Arya, just not use Arya if you can help it, is a bit more nuanced than it is as of last week, as of lately rather. So what we did in the homework is we had 3 assignments. Essentially, I had taken the website that we built in in session 4, and I had augmented it slightly. What I did was I added some Arya markup to some elements, and essentially I told you guys to look at them and then see what the problem was, or why this may not be the best idea ever, and all sorts of other things of that nature. Now, the way that this goes is that Arya is very sort of more of an art and science sometimes. So what I wanted to accomplish with doing these, and some of you were really close, and some of you actually got it all the way, when submitting your homework, was that there were like answers that were like the right ones. As it, like, if this were to be a test, that would be like get you full marks. And there was also some really creative people that did something else that still worked, and I gave them credit for that, because it worked, and sometimes really that's all you need. We're going to look at that file in just a moment, and I'm going to see what I did to it. And then, yeah, essentially that's what we're doing. So let me turn on my speech.
Untitled Visual Studio Code. Untitled 1 Visual Studio Code document. Application. Main landmark. Untitled 1 editor as autocomplete multi-line.
As you can hear, Visual Studio Code can be quite chatty. Now, let me super quickly find this file. Here it is. Now I'm going to do there's going to be a lot of screen reader output in this particular demo, because I have to show things off and I have to code. I'm going to explain what I'm doing as I'm doing it, and I'm going to take you through what essentially is going to be, at the end of the class, a number guessing game. But we're first going to cover the homework. So what I did in this particular thing, let's go to the first exercise down here.
Lesser f equals ht, less slash l greater, less h3 Arya label, less h2 it equals heading 2 Arya hidden equals true greater, hello, less slash h2 greater.
Now, this has some Arya markup on the heading 2. It says h2,
less h2 it equals heading 2 Arya.
ID equals heading 2, Arya label equals, Arya hidden equals true, and then the text hello within the actual tag. Now, the question was, this heading is invisible for screen readers. Why is that? And the answer to that question was, well, because there's an Arya hidden equals true in there. Now, obviously there's a couple ways you can deal with this. You can flip the true to false, and that would be what JavaScript would do dynamically if you were to, for example, have a thing that only pops up when you press a button. So that true would flip to false, or the false would flip to true depending, and then you can see your stuff. In this case, that would be one way to do it. Some person just mangled the ARIA hidden attribute, which also made it show up, because HTML does not care about mangled code a lot of the time. And other people did other things that worked really well. So essentially, most of you got this one right. And then the second one was, what was the second one? We had one that was like with the thing. And then, yeah.
Less H3 ARIA label equals let us mess with the cited world and hide secret messages only screen readers can see greater potatoes less slash H3 greater.
So this is a heading 3 that has an ARIA label of let us mess with the cited world and put messages only screen readers can see. And then the actual message in the header is potatoes. So the question was, what do sighted people see when they look at this heading? And the answer would be potatoes, because ARIA label does not change the visual version of this heading. Now, again, most of you got this. Most of you realized that it didn't work the way it was, and you had to like essentially look past the ARIA label and then just look at what it says. The final question was a bit harder, and it may have required a little bit more research because these were not things I explicitly mentioned. One of them wasn't, at least. There were two things wrong with this the thing that I made. Like there was two ARIA properties on a div. Let's go down to that line.
Less L greater, less lead greater, less slash land. Less div ARIA level equals 8 role equals head and ARIA label equals don't do this please don't ever do this greater potato less slash div greater.
So this has 3 ARIA properties. ARIA label equals don't do this, don't ever do this, and essentially that's something only screen readers would see. Then potato is in there. It's a word, but we can't see that word because the ARIA label essentially overrides anything that's actually put in the tag as text. Now, we've seen that also in the heading 3 above, where it says potatoes instead of this other thing that we put. And
less div land. Less slash L greater. Land. Less div ARIA level equals 8 role equals head and ARIA
look at the final thing on that particular
land. Less div ARIA level equals 8 role equals head and ARIA.
If we look at the other ARIA attributes on this element, we have a role equals heading. It doesn't have the prefix of ARIA, but it's still an ARIA attribute in the sense that we're setting the accessibility role for this element to be a heading. And we're setting the level to be 8. And that particularly is broken because there is no such thing as a heading level 8. NVDA will read this. I don't know why, but NVDA will tell you it's a heading level 8. A lot of browsers and screen readers on other platforms may or will not do that because it's not officially supported. And therefore, it's a really bad idea to actually rely on this with anything involving like security. You should not use this ever. The other big no-no about this whole line is that we use a role equals heading on a div. There is no need for that, given we have a perfectly viable heading element that does this natively. And at this point, we're using ARIA wrong. We're essentially using ARIA to patch over essentially just terrible code. And that's bad. And that's what a lot of people do. You'll see this a lot in the wild, where people essentially build the thing first and then decide, you know, accessibility, right, we need to make them screen readers work, so they'll just slap ARIA labels on everything and call it quits, which is really annoying because at that point you have problems with localization, you have problems with if this site changes, the ARIA labels may no longer match up, and before you know it, you're in this really big mess where nothing makes sense anymore and people just don't know what to do. So this is what you'll find a lot in the field code bases, just ARIA labels that don't need to be there. This is also why you might at some point see labels that have things like aria-label as the text with like braces around it. That's probably a JavaScript statement going wrong. Trying to set a label that maybe wasn't set properly or doesn't exist at all on that property or on that component or anything of the sort. So at that point, you have a problem because, well, this button now doesn't have a proper label, and good luck getting that fixed because this actually usually happens on really large websites. Like I've seen LinkedIn do this a couple times. I've seen Amazon do this a couple times. So at this point, yeah, it can be really like iffy to use ARIA in this like patch over manner where you just essentially put a lick of paint on it to hide the huge hole in the wall that's there and like hope that people won't notice. That is the homework. essentially that was the 3 questions I asked you to look into should you want to. It wasn't mandatory. I never make these mandatory because, I know you guys have other things to do as well. Yeah, that was the homework exercises. Really cool for the people who submit it. Like, we found that Slido might have a bit of trouble fitting in the link. Like, it's only 160 characters you can put there, so people use Discord, people use the email, people use all sorts of other things to reach out to me and find and get me that information. So well done. The Discord is still open. You should certainly join, should you be able to. Like, I know that the CAPTCHA is annoying, so yeah, like I expanded on that last week. If you haven't seen that recording, it should be up on YouTube soonish if it isn't already. And yeah, that's essentially the end of the homework segment. So if you guys have questions about either last week's material or the homework that we did or the stuff I just said, this is the time to ask them before we move on to Python. Anyone? Come one, come twice.
Yes. First question. What is the best resource to start learning about ARIA, especially with very little programming experience?
I would say learn HTML first. At the moment, ARIA is, like I said, is sort of an extension on HTML. So you can really only use ARIA properly if you know what HTML already does for you. And otherwise, you run the risk of doing the exact same thing I just warned you about. Essentially, doing ARIA where there doesn't need to be ARIA. What I would recommend you do is learn HTML first. You can do that in several places. There's a couple of resources on the website. And then there's an article that I linked in last week's notes. That's a really good introduction to it. I would say look at that first. And then once you've done that, Google, for example, for the Mozilla Developer Network resources on ARIA, MDN. Those are really good. Like, I would say start with those. And WebAIM has a really good article on it as well. So there's several places you can go for this information. But I would say learn HTML properly first because you'll need it.
We have one hand. Khalid?
Yes. Hi, Florian.
Hello.
Yes, we talked about ARIAs to make web design, to make accessible. Are we going to talk about
Discord, try Acme number.
Excuse me.
what yeah, Jaws was talking.
Yeah, I turned it off.
That make software, desktop software or accessible. You are using Python, creating a software using Python, for example, or C# or whatever other.
Yeah, now that is a wonderful,
accessible.
yes, that is a wonderful slip and slide of epic proportions. Essentially, the way that works is there's several ways to do UIs on Windows. Like you may have heard terms like UIA thrown around, or MSAA, or various other of those symbols. iAccessible is one, and essentially they all do their own different thing. And then screen readers like NVDA essentially try to equalize that and make it into one thing that, for example, add-on authors can talk to, and without having to deal with all these different ways of doing it, make an application more accessible. Now, on the web, that's HTML and ARIA. On Windows, that is, for example, UIA, where like components tell screen readers that they are a button or a checkbox or things like that. And then depending on what you use, for example, there is Qt, there is WX Python, there is various other ones that you can use in your projects to make accessible UIs. It depends on the toolkit you use how you do that, and it's extremely varied and very different depending on how you do it. So it's really hard to answer that question like with a single recommendation. But for example, I would say if you want native controls on Windows using Python, your best bet is currently WX Python. That is a bit of a learning curve to it, but once you get figure out how all that works, that would be the thing to use to make UIs work.
Okay, next question is from Deborah.
Hello, good morning. I know basic HTML. And I know how to look up tags if I don't know what a tag does.
Right.
But I've noticed a lot of times when I'm looking at the source of a web page because it's not perfectly accessible and I want to chat with a developer about a problem, that it looks like it was written by some machine, because it's all mishmashed together and it's not,
Yes.
neatly in lines. How do you read that stuff and find the problem when you can tell it wasn't written by a human?
So what's happening there is a process called minification, and essentially what they do is they make all the white space and all the everything disappear as far as they can in order to reduce file size, so it's easier for people to download, for example, in lower people with like not very good internet or things like that. So the problem there is that if you look at a page source with Control U, you're gonna run into that. The easiest way to really look at a page bit by bit, as it were, without having that get in the way, is use your inspect element within your DevTools. It is somewhat inaccessible. Like it does work, but it's a bit to get like properly, like to find stuff. But it can certainly be used, and I would definitely recommend using that. Or the some of the resources I linked in the notes for last week, for example, the web accessibilizer that is on that page, they would really help you out with this kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Not a problem.
Question in the chat, isn't Arya a downloader too?
Yes, it is, but it's a very different Arya. That's sometimes things share names. Arya is also a thing in music. It's a particular type of music. So yeah, Arya, and there's a lot of things.
And that's all the questions so far.
Perfect. Now, one of you caught this, and I was just actually like, well, one of your relatives caught this, and it's actually kind of funny to me because that was cool. I did not indent the HTML for this exercise. And I didn't do that for a reason. Like, essentially, normally what I say, and I think I've said this even in a previous lecture, you do tend to indent code, no matter what code it is. Like, if it's CSS, HTML, Python, C#, doesn't really matter. The big difference is that if you do this in Python and you do it wrong, Python crashes. If you do it in any other language, your colleague crash. Because it's really hard to read for sighted people when you don't indent your code. And actually, once you get used to using indent reporting features in your for example, your MVDA, like the beeps, you'll hear me use the beeps a lot. It can actually really help you in quickly speeding through code without having to like look at every line of code individually, because you can listen to where you are in the indentation tree. And at that point, okay, I'm still in this function that I don't care about. I can skip forward. So it's a really good idea to get into indenting. This is the final time I didn't do this. Like, subsequent things I'll show off will indent. But to be fair, most things I'll be showing off from this point forwards are Python, and therefore they would crash if I didn't. So yeah, that is the thing we're doing. Indentation, for people who aren't familiar with the term, is the practice where you essentially leave a bit of room at the beginning of a line to essentially indicate that something is nested within something else. For example, if I were to want to indicate that my title tag within my head tag is within my head tag rather, I would indent my title tag 4 spaces, saying, okay, the head tag starts at just the complete left of the line, and then my title tag is 4 spaces indented. You can do that with tab in Visual Studio pretty quickly. Tabs are generally transformed to spaces, but there's settings for that. You can look up on Google how to change all that. And that is a quick way to do it. You can also use Shift Tab to unindent by a certain amount of spaces, which is super useful if you, for example, remove something, an outer something, and now everything needs to be moved one level down. You can do that with Shift Tab after selecting the lines. Now, as I said, we're going to be covering some Python today. Let me just quickly look at the clock.
7:19 p.m.
7:19. Okay, perfect. We're nice on time here. We're going to be covering a couple of new things. Like, they have come up in the glossary, and we've seen some of them in that one Python file we looked at the other time. What was it? The 10 elephants, 9 elephants, 8 elephants thing. So we will not loop again, but we will use conditionals. We might use a function. I think we'll use a function next week, though, when we refactor this project. For now, we're going to make this like we're going to do a essentially first prototype of, like I said, a number guessing game, and we wanted to have a couple of features. It's going to be super simple, but it's going to be something that you can build by yourself. Please don't follow along with me during class, because at that point I think you'll get lost really quickly. The finished code will be available for you once I'm done. Once the class is over, I will make sure that's in the notes for this week's lesson. And then once we've done all that, I'll give you like a couple of things to add to it as homework if you would like to. So when you start a program like this, the first thing you'd want to do is write some kind of specification. What does the program need to do? For that, I'm going to make a new file. Actually, let me quickly murder Discord before that gets in the way again. There. So I'm going to go here. And we're going to close this HTML file. We don't need it anymore.
Untitled one editor as autocomplete multi-line blank.
We have a new file, like an untitled file.
Blank.
I'm not going to... Well, actually, I might as well do that. I'm just going to turn off the speech so you guys can hear me while
Speech
I
mode
type. We need to write down a couple things that this program needs to do. So the way of guess a number, generally the way it works is Python asks you, hello, hey, user, this is Python, and you want to play the guess the number game. Please enter a number. And then the user enters a number, and then Python will be, okay, number is lower or higher than, say, we will hard code the number 20 right now. We'll just make it 20. We'll know that the number that we need to guess is 20 for debugging purposes. Your homework might be to make this number variable. We can certainly do that. That's very easy to do. But for now, the number will be 20. So the idea is Python thinks of a number, in this case 20. So Python thinks of the number 20.
Speech mode deeps. Speech Python thinks of the number 20. Line dot 02 space R space 2 Z dot line feed.
Then Python
speech mode off.
Asks the user for a guess. So it'll print like type your guess, type your number. Then Python checks if the number entered is higher, lower, or equal to the number 20. Python gives feedback to the user. Now this is essentially an algorithm. This is what an algorithm essentially is. So we have taken a problem that we want to solve, and we've divided it up into steps. You do first this, then this, then this, then this. Now, the way I generally do this, I do it iteratively. So for example, I will first write this really boringly. Like I'll make sure that everything works. And then afterwards, I might, for example, add functionality that, I don't know, maybe functionality that plays a little sound when you get the right number or something like that. We can see how far we get. But this is our specification, and this is also our algorithm. This is what we do. We have a set of steps that we need to follow, and we can actually follow this pretty well down the line, because essentially Python is interpreted, like we covered in the third lecture. It's interpreted from top to bottom, unless there's some kind of conditional or other like flow statement, control flow statement as they're called, like an if or a loop or some other similar thing. Now, we will look into how that works, but let's just start for now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a command line window open. You're not going to be able to see this command line window because reasons, but what you will do is you'll be able to hear what the command line window says, and I will narrate what I do in the window. So the code will be in the editor, and it's going to be available all the time. The command line window will not be currently visible, but that's okay, because we don't really need to see what happens there, because I will tell you and the screen reader will tell you as well. So first thing we need to do is make a new file.
Untitled to editor as autocomplete multi-line blank.
I have pressed Control N to do that. I'm going to immediately save this file, give it a name, because Visual Studio Code likes to have the file extension in order to determine what kind of file we're working with. So if this Python, is this HTML? So we're going to save this file.
Save as not.
I'm going to make sure that it's saved in a file, in a
C,
folder
colon,
where
backslash.
I can use it.
USER. S. Users. FLORI. Flori. SAMPLES. Samples. Backslash.
It's in my samples folders where I put all my trials and little tidbits that nobody else needs. Yeah. So we will call this file numbers.py.
UMBERS number PY. Untitled to Visual Studio. Blank.
Now, I will double check that I have an interpreter selected by just doing a random
Error.
Python.
Linter might be is not installed.
Okay, well, it doesn't like the fact that I don't have MyPy installed. That doesn't really matter at this point. So we are going to check if auto-suggest work by typing FR for the word from.
FR. Suggest list from not selected 1 of 222.
Works fine. Also, the
Number
error notification went off, indicating that what I was typing wasn't done. Well, that's understandable because we weren't done typing it yet, but it does, trigger an error notification immediately. So that is something to be aware of. Now,
R.
If we look back at our...
Quick input list. Python thinks of the number 20. Untitled 1.
If we look at our algorithm, the first thing we need to do is...
Python gives feed. Python thinks of the number 20.
Python thinks of the number 20. So we know how to do that.
Quick input list. Mainland.
Because we've covered that in a previous lecture. The way to store a number in memory, like to make Python hold on to it, is to make a variable. So we make a variable, and we'll call it write_guess, for example. Let's do that. Write
HT line. Red notify change.
Guess
Space
equals 20.
20. Write guess equals 20. Blank. Write guess equals 20. Blank.
And there's no more error notification, so Python's happy with this line. Cool.
Write guess equals 20.
Now,
Blank.
to debug this, to make sure that we actually have the number 20 stored, in small programs like this, really all you need to do is just print out the value of that little variable. So let's do that.
RIFE. Suggest list. Print not selected 1 of 356.
So it's telling me you probably want to print. It's correct. So we'll do the left parent.
Left parent. Star values. Object. Print. Value. Sep equals. End equals n. File equals size dot stout. Flush equals false. Prints the values to a stream or to size dot stout by default. Optional keyword arguments. File like
And that's a bit much. I'm going to turn off docstrings for now because it's a bit overwhelming.
Space. Suggest list. End equals not selected 1 of 206. Numbers dot left parent. Left right parent.
And what it wants here is it wants an argument to print. Now, if we type the letters RIG.
R-I such G. G, except in right made 1 additional edits. Angle, float, hint, numbers.py editor as autocomplete multi-line print, right. Left T, H, G, I, R, left T.
I made a mistake. So normally, what I would expect is that it would pick up the number
right guess equals 20.
Right guess. It didn't do that. It picked up the word right. So I should have given it more to work with. This is what happens when you hurry.
Print, left parent, T, left R, I, G, H, T, left parent.
To remove
right,
this.
Right parent, blank. Right parent, right left T, H, G, I, R, left T. T, left parent, star values, object, print, R, G, suggest T, line, right guess.
So I just type right and followed by an underscore. Now we have right guess as an auto-suggest. So if I press the tab key, now it'll insert that variable name.
Numbers.py editor as autocomplete multi-line print, right guess.
Now this is always good to do because at this point you ensure you're not making typos. Like you using the variable name exactly the way you used it before, because that's where VS Code is getting that auto-suggest from. So if you do it once, this does have the unfortunate circumstance that if you mistype a variable name once, and you'll just keep auto-completing it like this, you'll keep misspelling it everywhere, which is, like, codically it's fine. Like, in the code it's fine, but obviously it is a bit of a, if you show this to a person and you have, like, something misspelled everywhere, that's a little bit funny. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, we have 2 lines in this program.
Print,
we
right.
have...
Print, right guess, print, right guess.
Oh, yeah.
Right guess equals 20.
We have right guess equals 20, and then
print right guess.
Right guess.
Right guess equals 20.
There is an error on this line.
Print right guess.
Let's see what the problem is. Control-Shift-M to see what the problem is.
Showing 4 problems preview. Level 2 error generated by Flick 8. Token error. If a multi-line statement at line 1 and character 1. Error generated by pylons. Statements must be separated by new lines or semicolons at line 5 and error generated by pylons. Expected expression at line 5 and character 19. 3 of 4 level 2.
Now this is super obscure. It's not really clear what the problem is here, and this will happen. Like, you get a lot of feedback from Python, but it's not super clear where the issue is, and this is where you need to start hunting. So if we go to this error here,
main landmark, numbers right parent, S E U G line,
we can immediately see what the problem is. Like, it's pointing us to the end of this right guess, like this print call that we did, and it says that there is a problem there. It's saying expression expected which is really Python-esque for you did something and it shouldn't be here. Like I was expecting like the next line to happen or some other thing or anything of the sort, but there's just a random right paren here that shouldn't be here. So we will remove that paren.
U-E-S-S, right parent, land, right parent.
Now the line is fine.
Right S equal print, right S.
We'll save this, and we will go into a command line window. Windows R.
Run dialog.
CMD.
CMD.
Press enter.
Text on C window.
Then move into our samples directory because we just made a file in the samples directory in VS Code. We also need to take our command line window there in order to make sure that we can run the file that we just made from the command line. So I'm going to do CD followed by SAM tab. And it auto-completes it to pulls, I guess, samples. We're in here now. And if I were to now do Python space numbers.py, because I did not add a shebang at the top of the script. Like a shebang is a hashtag symbol, then an exclamation point, then essentially a shell invoker, which we're not using here because it's really not necessary, particularly on Windows. We do Python, and then we give it the argument of the file name we want to run, in this case numbers.py. Let's do that. And we'll press enter. Now, that echoes out 20, because that's literally what we told it to do. Just store the number 20, and then add that number that we just stored into a print statement, and then print it to the screen. Now, it did that, so great. Let's add a couple more lines to this, and then stop for questions for just a bit. Going back to our editor, we have 2 lines. We're going to add a third one.
Land, right parent, land.
We can remove this right guess, actually. We don't really need this line anymore. Control-Shift-K deletes the current line, irrespective of selection.
Right guess equals 20.
So now we only have the right guess equals 20 line. This doesn't need to be here either.
From turtle import right.
Oops.
Land, from turtle import right. From turtle import right.
That's wrong.
Undo. Land, from turtle, land, right guess equals 20. Land, line from...
I see. This is a leftover from the thing before that we did wrong. So we'll move this.
Land, right guess equals land.
We'll move this.
Right guess equals 20.
And now we just have this one line.
Right guess, land,
essentially,
0, land.
There were a couple of lines inserted because of an autocomplete that I accepted earlier that was wrong. An import that has now been removed. So we store the number. So let's greet the user first. We can do that with a print statement. We already know it. So let's do, can turn off the screen reader for a second here so I can speak.
Speech mode off.
Print. And there's like auto suggests happening at the moment. We don't really need them. Quote. Welcome to guess the number. Exclamation point. No, that's enough of a welcome message. Okay.
Speech, land, print, welcome to guess the number. Right guess equals 20.
And now again, we can save this. Go back to our command line.
C.
With Alt Tab. And then we do up and enter to rerun the code again. Okay, awesome. So now it says welcome to guess the number instead of 20. We've changed that print statement to no longer echo out 20 because we know that that works. That print statement for debugging purposes is no longer needed. Now, the next thing obviously is we need to capture. Let's look at our list.
Quick input list. Python thinks of the number 20.
Yeah, we got that.
Python asks the user for a guess.
That's our next one. We need to ask the user for a guess. So let's do that. Now,
quick input list. Mainland.
Print outputs to the screen, and there's a function appropriately named input that takes input from the user. So let's
print welcome to guess.
Put an input statement here. Input.
I-N-U-T input put left parent prompt subject equals read a string from standard input. The trailing new line is stripped. The prompt string if given is printed to standard output without a trailing new line before reading input. If the user hits CF *Dix CTRLD Windows CTRLZ plus return raise the error on *Dix systems read line is used if available. Hint numbers.py editor as.
So it gave us a bunch of information there. It told us what it expects here. It wants us to put in a string to send to this to the standard out as it's called, which is essentially just our command line. And it reads a line of text from the user.
Left parent, right parent.
Well, that's exactly what we want because we want a number from the user. So we're going to make this very naive and not do any type checking on this. That'll be homework.
Left key.
All right,
left, right
so
parent.
let's add a proper, like, please enter a guess. Let's do that.
Quote,
please
enter
space
A space
a guess.
G-U-E-S-S guess quote. Right line feed.
We have please enter a guess. I'm gonna save that, run that. Our little game is coming together. Like if I now type something, the program exits, and I'll explain why that is in just a second. But I'm first going to open the floor for some questions.
First question, what is refactoring a project?
Refactoring is the process of taking code that works but could be done better or more elegantly, and then applying various changes to it to make it look better or to make it work better.
Next question is from Deborah.
Hi, so if I'm learning Python, I've noticed that when you look for problems, it's showing you all these lint errors and warnings. How can I have it just show me syntax errors? Because I don't care about type mismatches and stuff when I'm still in the learning process.
You turn off linters. So there are settings for the various linters in the settings for the Python extension, for PyLint and for MyPy and for various other ones. You just toggle those off.
And you have those on because you're a real programmer. You're not in the learning mode anymore.
I'm like the OG real one. Yeah,
Right.
Exactly. But yes, I even have it a little bit overkill at the moment. I have several linters at the same time that are essentially all telling me very similar things at times. So I need to tweak my setup a bit to only have like one that I like. I haven't quite decided which one I like yet, so that's why they're all on at the moment.
Next question, they're losing the screen reader output every time you're in the command line.
Oh, that's a problem. That's good that you mentioned that. I was not aware that Zoom was that picky. Okay, that's good. I will narrate what it says then. Essentially, what we did is we did Python space numbers.py a couple times. And the first time it responded with 20, like we expected. And the second time it responded with welcome to guess the number. And the third time it responded with welcome to guess the number. Please enter your guess. I typed some numbers and then it just went back to the regular prompt. It's good that you point that out because I do mean to indicate that you guys know what's happening in the command line. So yeah, that's what that did.
Okay, next question is from Alan.
Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, those comments at the beginning when you're telling what the program is doing about, we're guessing a number, et cetera. And those are actually called programmer comments, I guess, and they're indicated. Refresh my memory how you indicate those in Python.
So I didn't actually put these in the program. I put them in a separate file at the moment. But you're right. We could totally put these in comments, and you indicate those with a number sign.
Okay, great, thanks.
So what you could do is you could, for example, first have a number of comments that say, okay, this is guess the number. It was written by Alan, and it was super awesome, and it's going to do the so and so following, and then below that you do your code. That's pretty common, particularly for like when you're learning out. So you can like scroll up. I don't do that because I like being able to quickly flip between my code and my algorithm, so I have them in separate files. That's literally the only reason.
I am not seeing, oh, wait a minute, there's one in the chat.
Okay.
Can you please demonstrate how to run the code again?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing you do, and I'm going to narrate for the screen reader because you guys can't hear it. So the first thing you do is you Windows R to go to your run dialog. Then you do CMD to open your command line, and usually your CMD opens in your home folder. So your C/users/yourname/folder. That's where you go. Next, you have to go to where your file is that you saved with Visual Studio Code. Like that depends on where you saved it. I put mine in my samples folder. So that is C users, Flori, samples, and then it's there. And once you're in that, once you know where that is, you go CD space and then the folder name. So for example, in my case, it's CD samples, enter, followed by Python, the word Python space, your file name.py. Obviously your file name will already have .py, but like you need to do the full file name. I'm saying obviously sometimes Windows is set up to not show file extensions for known file types. I do not know if that happens to Python files, because that's one of the first things I always turn off when I get a new computer. So if you're finding that you're putting .py at the end of files and it's not showing up, that is why. It's there, it's just not being shown to you. But yeah, you do Python space your file, essentially. And then Python will run your file and give you, well, whatever output you requested of it. I hope that makes it clear.
Okay, next question. I am using a music app called Sound Cells. It
Mhm.
uses code and ABC notation to compose music. How can I use this programming for music notation using this app?
I don't know. I've never seen that app. I can look into it and check it. Like, I'm not sure if that uses Python as well or some other programming language, but I can certainly look into what that uses and get back to you next week, or you can email me off class and then we can discuss it. My email can be found on the class website. You can hop on the Discord. There's all sorts of really cool ways to find me and to reach me. So yeah, come talk to me after class.
The next question is, how about adding guess attempt to the game?
A guess attempt. I'm not sure if I understand what you mean. Like how many times you've guessed? Because yeah, like I said, this is very much a minimum viable product, as it's called. Like, we're doing the super basic logic at first, and we're actually going to iterate on this next week. So yeah, we will definitely make sure there's only an X amount of times you can guess then, or maybe they'll make it homework. We'll see. Nah, I'm not
Okay,
that cruel.
I'm gonna let you get going.
Perfect. Okay, so let me go back to our editor so you can hear the screen reader.
Numbers.land.
Yeah, we're back in numbers.py. Our next thing on the list is,
Quick input list.
let's
Main.
see.
Python thinks of the number 20.
We have that.
Python asks the user for a guess.
We have that now.
Python checks if the number entered is higher, lower, or equal to the number 20.
Okay, now we get into the fun stuff. So
Quick input list. Main.
what we saw earlier is that when you do this,
Input, please enter a guess.
input, please enter a guess, we need some way of checking that input, because right now we need to make sure that the input is either lower, higher, or similar to the guess, the right guess. And currently we cannot do that, because when we run the program in its current form, as soon as you input a number, it's going to go away. So what you need to do is you need to store this somehow. And you may remember from the last session, a function like input or print is essentially a little machine that takes an input, does something to it, and then returns some kind of output. I'm so sorry for that noise. I'm somewhat like, my hands are somewhat tied about a couple of these things, unfortunately. Now, the way that these things work is very simple. You take input, which essentially takes what the user entered, and outputs what the user should see. So at that point it asks what you, excuse me, just a moment. Excuse me. What was that? Yeah. Okay. So essentially, when you do a function takes an input, returns an output, and that output is stored somewhere. It's stored in a place, and that place is essentially a variable. You can make that be a variable or a list or other things that essentially store stuff. Like if we go up at the first line here,
Right guess equals 20.
right guess equals 20 is a variable that we store the number 20 in. And the result of a function call can also be similarly stored in a variable. So if I were to go back down here
Input, please enter a guess.
and go to the beginning of that line, which I cannot do on this keyboard, just a second.
Number, guess, guess, number. Right line, I.
So we have input with bracket, with like input, paren, quote, please enter a number, quote, write paren. So that's a function call, just like the print one. And print doesn't return anything. Input does, namely, it returns what the user enters back. And we need that. So what we can do here is we can take a variable, like, for example, response.
RESPONSE, response, space.
Equals,
space.
input, blah, blah, blah. So now if I read this line again with the screen reader.
Print response equals input, please enter a guess. Blank.
Response equals input, please enter a guess. So now at this point we're saying input, throw that line at the user, wait, then store whatever the end user enters back into response.
Response blank.
And that's good because we need response in order to check it against right guess, which is our 20. So again, we can debug this by doing print.
print star values object print value.
Well, for example, we can do quote.
Quote.
You
entered. ENTERED entered space. Quote space
plus
space.
And we don't need to convert it to string here because this is already a string. Newsflash, this might become a problem later and will be a homework thing.
Plus space right parent.
You entered response.
RE suggest EONE. Spawn E. Right line feed.
Now.
Print you entered plus response. Blank.
I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to my command line.
And
I'm going to run this again. From this point, I'm doing Python space numbers.py. It tells me, welcome to guess the number. Please enter a response. And I'm typing the word blah. It tells me you entered blah and exits, which is exactly what we wanted. At this point, we are storing the response until the program exits. We're getting somewhere. Make sure quickly look at the time.
7:46 p.m.
Yeah, no, we're doing just fine time-wise. Awesome. So response is saved. Now what? We need to check it against right guess because right guess has the number 20 in it. That's our number. That is the number that we want to use. And this particular noise I can turn off, and I will do that right this minute because that is getting really annoying. In the meantime, NVIDIA has died. The interesting thing about storing, I'll let that finish because it's loud. There we go. Now, we'll be slightly less inconvenienced by some of the noises. I'm actually not sure if they're coming through. I don't think so, but they're annoying me.
They're not coming through for us, so.
Okay,
just
perfect.
you.
Well, they're annoying me then. That's fantastic. Just me who has to suffer. Beautiful.
Land. Print you entered.
We entered this print statement. We have it stored. We have response. We can work. We can continue. Now, awesome. Like I said, we're going to compare against right guess. Right guess is a number. And we're going to check if whatever the user entered is going to be lower, higher, or the same as right guess. Now, if you do that to the word blah, obviously things are going to explode. So we're going to, for the moment, naively assume that people are playing by the rules and we'll just literally only enter numbers. It's a very simple way to make sure that that happens, but that's for homework. So that's something you guys get to research.
Land.
Anyway.
Print you land.
We have these lines, and at this point we need to do an if statement. Because we have three branching paths, as it were, that the code can go at this point. It can either tell us, okay, you're too low. It can tell us, okay, you're too high. Or it can tell us, you genius, you just, guessed the number. Awesome, super cool. So the way you can do that is by an if statement.
Print land.
And an if statement is a so-called conditional or a control flow statement. They go by different names. This is just giving the animal several different names. And what you find in a lot of beginning programming courses for the cited, these kinds of things have visual shapes. So you can essentially take a logic block that is an if, and then you just place the things that you need for that in the if, and then visually, it makes perfect sense. Now, we don't have that. There's no real equivalent for that for blind people currently, apart from CodeJumper. So, hey, have CodeJumper plug APH. What I do for your customer base. I'm nice. Anyway, CodeJumper kind of does this.
Print land.
And we have to do it with code for the rest. So what I'm going to be doing is exactly that. We have our two variables and we know what we need to do with them. So let's just do it then.
Print blank.
Let's start with an if.
If. F left parent numbers.py editor as autocomplete multi-line if. Left parent, right parent.
Now, the way it works is you do an if, and then you open paren, and Visual Studio will add a closing paren, so a parenthesis, and you put your expression. So in this case, for example, let's do
left F, left
if
parent, right parent.
Response
RESPONSE response space numbers.py
is less than,
less.
So the less than character is
Space.
less than right guess.
RI right H T right. I line right guess. Numbers.py editor as autocomplete multi-line if response less right guess. S right parent line feed.
And then we end to the end of the line we put a colon, and you'll see something cool happen.
Colon.
Beep. Beep here means I moved up an indentation level. Because if I go up,
If response less right guess. Blank. If response speech mode off. Speech mode beeps. Speech mode top blank. If response blank.
okay, you can only hear the beeps when speech is speaking. That's an interesting way to do it, NVDA, but I'll take it.
If response less right guess.
So, these are throwing errors right now. Doesn't matter. We'll look at those when we're done. So at this moment, we will only cover the less than path. I will put a print statement
Blank.
that says
PRINT int left parent. Quote.
your
What?
guess
URS guess space
is too low.
is space EOO2 space LOW.
Your guess is too low.
Low quote right parent.
There we go.
If response print your guess is too low.
Awesome.
Blank. Print your guess is if response less right guess.
Now, it doesn't like this line. Let's see what the problem is here.
Showing 4 problems preview. Level 1 4 problems and file numbers. Level 2 error generated by pylons. Operator less not supported for types str and literal 20. Operator less not supported for types str and literal 20 at line 5 and character 4. 1 of 4.
Aha.
Main landmark numbers. Response. Right guess. S right colon line feed.
So
Colon.
it's complaining about the fact that I'm asking a number to be compared to a response.
Right guess. Response less. Right guess. Space. Less.
But this is Visual Studio being smart. We are dumb, so let's just try if it works anyway. I think it will. I'm going to go in here.
C.
Into my command line. I'm going to run python numbers.py. Now, two things can happen here. One, I forget if this will just work implicitly. Like if it does, great. If it doesn't, then I'm just ruined your homework for you. But let's see what it does. I typed python space numbers.py again. It's doing the same thing as before, asking me for a guess. Now the problem is that
Do you want
if
us to
there-
hear that? We can't hear that.
No, you can't hear that. That's fine. The problem with this approach is that right now Python is in the area that we know works. Like it's not going to just crash when there's a small problem somewhere down the line of your code. It'll only do that when you get to it. So if I type the number 1 right now, it's probably going to either work or blow up. Let's see what it does. It blows up. So I get an error that essentially comes down to the following. It says less not supported between instances between str and int. So the problem here is I'm trying to compare a string to an integer. I was going to make this homework. I thought Python was smarter than this, but I guess I haven't used this kind of stuff for a bit. The way to solve this is to make them equal. So what we can do is we can go up to this line.
Print response equals input. Please enter a guess.
Here.
Print enter response equals input. Please enter a guess. Please enter a guess. UESS colon quote right parent line feed. Response equals input blank.
And then we do. We need to do something to this response. Now you can do this in one line, but I'm not going to do that for readability sake. I'm going to change response to be a number instead. So I'm going to do response
response space numbers.py editor
equals
space
parse
par params s proceed line parse and find I parse config h and parse and find t numbers.py editor as autocomplete t and I line e s r a t I n t int.
It's just int. Okay, let's do so. Parse instead of response input, we put the line below that. We do response equals
I
int
numbers n t line feed t n I space I n t line feed.
And if we do a left bracket here, left parent
x str byte supports index supports string equals int x and gt integer int x base equals 10 and gt integer convert a number or string to an integer or return 0 if no arguments are given.
So that was a bit of alphabet soup there, but essentially the more important thing of that was convert a number or string into an int. And that's exactly what we want to do here, because we want to take the contents of response and turn it into an int. So Python knows to compare an int to an int. So we will do response equals int left paren response.
Spot E right line feed.
Right paren. So essentially we're telling transform yourself into a number. I'm going to see if it works, and then I'm going to pause again because this was actually a little bit more involved than I expected. And I do want to give people the chance to ask questions. So let's see if this works now. I'm going to go back to my command line. I'm running the program again. It's asking me to enter a guess. I'm typing the number 1. And there's another problem, because right now we have been neglectful
Print letter plus response.
in this line. So right now, this is no longer working because now we're trying to add a string to an int. Now, there's 2 ways to fix that. The image we have right now is we have these few lines in succession.
Response equals input. Please enter a guess.
So we're getting a response, which is a string. Then
Response equals int. Response.
we're taking that response and making it into a number, to an integer.
Print letter plus response.
And now this doesn't work anymore because this is expecting a string. So what we can do here is we can cut this line.
No selection.
And move it above the int call.
Response equals int. Response. E R line feed. R blank.
I've done like enter at the beginning of that line to make a new line above the response equals int left paren response right paren line, and I'm pasting in that one that we have below there.
Paste blank. Blank.
So now we have this sequence.
Print letter plus response equals input. Please enter a guess. Print letter plus response. Response equals int. Response.
So now we're just making sure that the response got there okay. We can actually remove that line soonish because we know it works. And then we're transforming the response into a number. Now, if I run this again, this is a flow you'll get used to. You essentially change your code, go back to your command line, run the program again, look at the error if there is any, and then fix it. And then keep doing that over and over and over again. Now, Visual Studio Code will also tell you about these problems, and this is when having your linter off is a good idea, because at that point you only get syntax errors. But VS Code will not catch runtime errors. Like, it'll see if you do something wrong in your Python, and it's getting smarter and smarter knowing when something is considered a syntax error and when it's considered something else. But because this is such an interpreted language and it essentially runs as it does, there will be runtime errors where the code works but doesn't quite do what you expected it to do, or runs into an error that isn't necessarily syntax based. In this case, we're going to run the program again. You guys can't hear this, but that's okay. I can, and I'm telling you that I'm running the program the exact same way we've done several times now. It's asking me for a guess. I'm typing the number 1. And now it says you entered 1, your guess is too low. So our if statement that checks the validity of the guess down here,
If response less right guess. Print your guess is too low.
now works.
Blank.
Now we've done a couple of things here. Maybe that response equals int paren response paren was the most strange bit, because at that point that seems to be strange perhaps. So at this point I do want to pause again.
7:58 p.m.
We still have quite some time and we're almost done with this already, so have at it. If you guys have questions, this is the moment to ask them.
So one question in the chat, are you indenting where required, or is VS Code doing it automatically?
VS Code generally does it by itself. You do need to keep an eye on it, because if you're like changing code around, like fixing bugs, it'll do it on like pressing enter when it can predict what you mean and if you need to indent. But obviously if you're going to move stuff around, that'll become harder as it goes. If you go away from like the beaten path, there are auto formatters like AutoPep8 that do this for you, at least try to. But if there's a flaw in your code, that may not always work well. So you do need to keep an eye on this yourself as well.
Deborah has a question.
Go ahead.
I'm a little confused about the you entered plus response line. Wouldn't it be you entered quote? Quote, you entered quote plus response, because you're concatenating response to that string you entered?
Yeah, that is what it does, actually.
Print your guess is too low.
Quotes though.
If response.
That's a good one.
Symbol level most.
I have my symbol level set to some, and it doesn't read quotes in that point. This is why I'm narrating them. But yes, you entered is in quotes, and then plus, and then the response.
Okay, got it.
No problem.
Okay, Alan has his hand raised.
Okay.
So when you're in your Python example you've just been going over, is the default in Python for input to treat it as a string, or do you have to define each variable as to its type? Because I'm getting a little confused with your integer definition and all that stuff. So I hope that makes sense.
It does. So Python is pretty non-strict about this. Like you don't have to set a type. Actually, for a long time you couldn't. But when you try to compare or like add two types together, it does matter that they're the same type. So you can like internally make sure that something is of the same type, and you do that by, for example, the str paren method to make something into a string, and in this case the int paren to make it into an integer. This will matter if you're, for example, trying to add two integers together or two strings together, because that's different things. Like if you add two integers together, it does addition. And if you add two strings together, it does what's called concatenation, where it takes two strings and makes them into one string. So in that case, it matters. As for your question, input by default is a string.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Right, so what we're really doing when we're typing, for example, the number 1, Python sees that as quote 1 quote by default unless we change it.
Okay, the next question is Becky.
Hi, so I don't understand. When I was looking at Visual Studio Code yesterday, and I created a new file, it wanted the language. And I wasn't sure if that was that I just type English or do I put Python in that specific spot?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So language in this case refers to programming language.
Okay.
And generally, you don't need to really mess with that yourself. Like if you save a new file as a certain file, for example, the thing I did before where I just immediately saved the new file as numbers.py.
Yes.
At that point, it infers that you mean Python. So you don't need to explicitly set that yourself.
Okay, and then when it comes up with the 2, 3, 4, those are your problem, the things that you're actually trying to solve one at a time that you were going through, right?
You mean this?
Showing 3 problems preview. Info generated by colon. Missing module docstring at line 1.
No, you remember at the very beginning of this where you opened up Visual Studio and you were typing in the different things you wanted the program to do?
Oh, yeah, that was just me in a text file. That was me just literally typing lines of text.
Okay, so that isn't where, okay, so then the things that, like if I press enter after I was to type a language, or if I avoid that by naming it .py, can I just start typing in there? Because I've never worked with Visual Studio.
Like what code. I did, like this is Visual Studio Code. What I did was just Control-N to make a new file, then Control-S, that just brings up the save dialog, and I just called it numbers.py, and at that point I'm just in an editor, like Notepad. So that choose a language thing should not come up. If it does, then something's gone squirrely somewhere, and you need to come talk to me after class.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Next question is from Avery.
Okay. You're not turning. Yeah, there you go.
All right. So if you had adversarial player and did like blah like you did earlier, how would Python interpret the variable assignment given that is not an int?
It'll blow up. Essentially, it'll crash. If you give it a string right now because it's expecting an integer, it'll just give you an error.
Okay. How would one check the input to make sure it's an int?
That is going to be a homework exercise.
Okay, great, cool.
Because yeah, there are ways to. This is called input sanitation or input escaping. And this is really important, for example, for security, because you should never trust a user input in a security setting, because users might type all sorts of things that'll mess up your website. And this is a really small example of how that could work. You could, for example, if you knew like some kind of way to dodge around Python's safeties, you could probably like dig into the program and maybe uncover the proper guess without even doing the guessing. I mean, that's not really how the game works, but if you were like a master hacker, you could probably do that. And input sanitation is one way to make that not happen. So yeah, this is going to be homework.
Next question is from Zach.
All right, Zach, go right ahead. You are audible.
All right. Quick question. I don't know exactly how this would work, and I don't know if this is beyond the scope, but when you print the thing earlier, remember when it blew up, and we had to add the response equals int left paren, response right paren, couldn't you, instead of having that line, could you, in the print statement, like, or I don't know exactly how this would work, but like you do print left paren, you guessed quote right paren, str left paren input or response.
What you're trying to do is combine function calls, and yes, you can absolutely do that. What we could, for example, do is
print left response equal print left parent quote welcome to guess the number response equals input left parent quote please enter a guess colon quote right parent.
We could do this. We could, for example, go if we go past the equal sign here.
SE space equals space.
What we could do is wrap this whole thing, this whole input statement, into an int call. So do this essentially.
Int left parent line x colon.
Now it says int left paren input left paren blah blah blah, and then you have to like close both of them after the end of the line. I didn't do that here because it's a bit harder to read.
Left parent.
Yes, you can absolutely do that.
Left T and I.
Okay. So it's not great for readability, but
it is nice and compact if you know what you're looking at. Like I wouldn't do this as a beginner course, but yeah, you will see this in the wild where you know, okay, I know that the return value of this function is going to be the argument for this other function, so you can do that. It's just, you need to know a little bit more about how functions work for it to make sense properly, so I'm not doing it here.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yep.
Question in the chat. When I use VS Code, I don't get the beeps on the indents, but I do get the sound when the program encounters an error. Does that indentation sound come from an NVDA add-on or a setting I need to enable?
It's a setting. It's in, if you go Control Caps Lock D,
NVDA.
It'll open the document formatting dialog, and there is an indent reporting combo box there. You can set it to spoken or beeps or both.
How many spaces of indentation is preferred?
Generally 4.
Next question is from Alan.
Yeah, and this is stupid, I know, but I'm a little confused still. You know, but back in 3 lifetimes ago when I took a programming class, and I'm writing my code. I'm used to being in an editor and writing the code. I'm still a little confused whether I'm going to be in something like Notepad or Notepad++ when I'm typing this numbers.py code, or am I going to be in VS Code when I'm doing that?
You can be in either, honestly. We're using VS Code because it gives you a lot of little tools, like for example that autocomplete for the variable names that I really enjoy using.
Right.
And it gives you that for free, and it's accessible. So if you're comfortable using that, you can use that. You could also use Notepad or Notepad++ if you want. That it really is a personal preference.
Okay, so if I'm doing it in VS Code, how do I actually save it to what I'm calling a text file when I'm done with all the automatic checks that it's doing and stuff?
So you just hit Control S, essentially the same as in Notepad.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Like you're literally like once you have like your file open, it's essentially exactly equivalent to just writing a Notepad file. So yeah.
I got you. Okay, but it gives you more power because it does checks and stuff for you as you're doing it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Next question. Is it possible to configure beeps with JAWS?
Yeah, you'd need to go into the Sounds and Schemes Manager and set it up there. There is, I think, a preset scheme that has them, and then you can turn you can change the noises there. I use piano keys, for example, for several levels of indentation, which you have sounds for already built into JAWS. So yes, you can do that in the Sounds and Schemes Manager. How that works is a bit beyond the scope of this, though.
How did you make Python choose random numbers?
That's also a homework exercise.
Okay, next question is from Donnie.
Oh, go right ahead, Donnie.
Can you enlarge the font on your screen? Enlarge the font.
I can make it a bit larger. That's fine.
Print left response equals input left parent.
Here. Is it too large now? Is it fine?
That's perfect, actually. It's beautiful.
Okay, perfect. There you go.
I am not seeing any. Oh, wait a minute. Got another question from Deborah.
All right, Deborah, go ahead.
Just briefly, JAWS will also do indentation indication. If you go in your settings center or quick settings and type indent in the search box, you'll find it.
Oh, that's neat. I did not know it was that clever about it. But yeah, okay, so you can do it that way. You can do the Sounds and Schemes Manager if you want more like, what's the word? Like
fine-grained control.
Yeah, fine-grained. Like I want this noise for this level of indentation, stuff like that. So that would be the way to do that. I think the way you're doing it is like a preset thing that it just tells you in like speech.
It says 2 spaces, 4 spaces.
Yeah, see, there you go. It'll tell you in words, which I find a little bit verbose.
Granularity, you'd use sound.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for the backseat gaming.
And you're good.
Awesome. All right.
8:11 p.m.
So we have about 10, 20 more minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the minimum viable product, and I'm going to like show off how that works, and then we're going to run through a little bit of a test to see if our MVP works. Now next week, and this is something I can tell already, next week we're going to expand on this. So we're going to do a couple of homework exercises. One of them is make the number random, so not have it always be 20. And the other one is make sure the program doesn't crash if you type words instead of numbers into the box. So those are the two problems that I'm setting you, the listeners, the viewers, to solve for next week. And you can submit that any way you like. You can use Slido, you can use Discord, Mail, Twitter. I'm on all the things. You can find me I'm a Google away, and there's an unhealthy amount of things on the internet about me. So it's really easy to find me in any place you'd like. But essentially that's your homework for next week. What we're going to do next week is we're going to add some swag to this program. We're going to make a noise when you get the right number. We're going to maybe refactor it, so we put the check in a function, so it's a little bit less cluttered. And we're going to do all the other things that make this minimum viable product into a slightly less minimum viable product and more of a version, say 0.5 or something like that. So that's what we're doing next week. I can already tell you that. And if we're done with that, we will, we'll see how far we can take this little guess the number program, make it into a proper Hollywood production. But let's, for the moment, finish up these if statements here, because we're almost done.
Response equals input, print response if left parent, response left right line as right parent, colon.
So we have the path for if it's less than the number.
Print left parent, quote your guess is too low, quote right parent.
So the natural next step would be to do the one that's above a certain number. And to do that, you can use what's called an else if or an elif in Python. So
print left parent, quote your guess is too low, quote right parent.
We're going to do that. We're going to do elif, elif.
elif. Left parent, numbers.py editor as
yeah, this is
left parent, right parent.
This is proper. Okay, so now it has elif with the parens, and we're in between the parens with the cursor. We're typing response.
Response space numbers.py
greater
space
right
underscore line right line s
tab
numbers.py editor s right parent
colon. Because we can't leave home without a colon. That's a bad idea. And we will put print
left parent quote
I will
space.
try not to speak over the screen reader. We will type your guess is too high.
GUESSISTOO2HIH high quote.
There we go.
Print left parent, elf left parent, response greater right line, guess right parent, colon. Print left parent, quote your guess is too high, quote right parent. Land.
As you can hear, I've upped the verbosity for characters a bit. That should make it a little bit easier to hear where the quotes are. I'm going to just quickly run this to see if we didn't make any mistakes, or we can actually look at the problems view here with Control-Shift-M.
Showing 6 problems preview. Warning
There are problems. They're probably only linter errors, but let's see what the linter has a problem with.
Level 2 warning generated by Flick 8 colon. Blank line contains white space at line 10 and character 1. 1 of 6.
Okay, so that's literally just a stylistic thing. There's a space on that blank line. Doesn't matter.
Warning generated by Flick 8 colon. No new line at end of file at line 10 and character 5. 2 of 6
There's
level
no
2.
new line at the end of the file. There is, but there's a space on it, so it doesn't register. Not a problem.
Info generated by Pilot colon. Missing module docstring at line 1 and character 1. 3 of 6 level.
We're not saying what this module does. We didn't document the module. This is a stylistic thing. Not a problem.
Info generated by Pilot colon. Constant name quote right line guess quote doesn't conform to upper line case naming style at line 1 and character 1. 4 of 6 level 2.
Interesting. It thinks that this is a constant. It technically is. And it tells me that stylistically I should make this all caps. Not going to do that. It's not a problem.
Info generated by Pilot colon. Unnecessary parents after if keyword at line 6 and character 1. 5 of 6 left. Info generated by Pilot colon. Unnecessary parents after elf keyword at line 8 and character 1. 6.
Now this is an interesting one. So unnecessary parens. You can leave the parens out. But I like to have them in.
Main landmark
so
numbers.
This is something I tend to do just in case, because it also helps with operator precedence, which is a mathematical concept we won't go into right now. But you don't have to have parens here. Like, you can apparently take them away.
Elf left parent. Response greater right line guess right parent colon.
I like to have them here, so I'm going to leave them alone. And it doesn't appear that we have any syntax errors. So let's quickly just run this program now.
C colon.
Doing that in the command line again. While you can run a program from VS Code, I do not recommend doing that because reading it is a little bit arduous. You have to go out of focus mode to the next edit field, which is then a terminal. And then you use Control up and down to read the actual output. I like using the command line myself better, but this is certainly something you can try if you'd like to. I'll run a program. Welcome to guess the number. Please enter a guess. I will type 30 because that's higher than 20 last time I checked. So let's see what it does. You entered 30. Your guess is too high. So our second path also works. Now, the final path.
Land. Print elf left parent.
We have essentially said, like, if it's too low, do this. If it's too high, do this. The only thing that's left between too high and too low is that we're actually right on the money. We have the right number. And you do that with an equals statement. And we can't use a singular equal sign in this case because a singular equal sign already does something. It assigns. So to check equality, we need to use a double equal sign. We can do that with an else. We don't even really need to do... You could do elif response equals right guess. That would work. But then you'd need to do an else that... does something else entirely. In this case, it doesn't. We don't need this because it's a minimum viable product.
Print land.
But hey, maybe you want to do that for your homework. Who knows?
Print left land.
We will do else for the moment. So we'll do else.
E. Suggest S. E.
Just the word else, followed by a colon.
C colon numbers dot py editor.
And we will, to finish up, put
R I N T N T star values colon quote.
You
got it. It's bang. Quote right parent space print left parent quote you got it quote right parent.
Awesome.
Print left parent.
Now
Else colon. Print left parent quote you got it quote right parent.
We're gonna save this, and what I'm going to do is, can I run this from here? I can maybe show this off in the editor.
Terminal 1 use CTRL plus up arrow and CTRL plus down arrow to navigate the terminal buffer edit blank. Windows PowerShell copyright left parent. C right parent. Microsoft Corporation. All rights reserved. Try the new cross-platform PowerShell https://aka.ms/store 6 warning colon. PowerShell detected that you might be using a screen reader and has disabled PS read line for compatibility purposes. If you want to read enable it run import module PS read line. Windows PowerShell copyright left parent. C right parent.
Yeah, it's going to do that again. We're not going to let it.
One.
So we are in the terminal here, and we can use Control up and down to read.
C colon backslash use 0.4.1 backslash C. Welcome to guess the number 28 of 29 level 1. Please enter a guess colon 29 of 29 level 1.
So it's saying, please,
welcome to guess the number 28 of 29 level 1. Please enter a guess colon 29 of 29 level 1.
Let's enter like 15.
1 5 15. Welcome to guess the number. Please enter. Welcome to guess the number 28 of 29 level 1. Please enter a guess colon 29 of 29 level 1. Out of list clickable terminal 1. Python debug button remote. Clickable terminal. Terminal 1, 5, 15. You entered 15. Your guess is too low. PSC colon / users / Flori / samples greater. Debugging stopped.
So there you go. If you type 15, it does that. Now, if we run this again.
You entered 15. Your guess is too low. PSC colon / users / Flori / samples greater. PSC colon / users / Flori / samples greater. CLS. You entered 15. Your guess is too low. List with 7 items. Welcome to guess the number. Please enter a guess colon. Out of list clickable.
You can see why I don't prefer this method.
Terminal.
It works. You can get to your data, but it's somewhat arduous to do.
No next edit field.
So I'm going to now enter the word, the number 20, because that's our guess, and let's see
2,
if the
0.
final path in our program triggers.
20. Debugging stopped. You entered 20. You got it. PSC colon / users
Nice.
/ Flori / samples greater.
So there you go. We have finished our minimum viable product. We can go look at the list again.
See. Quick input list. Main landmark.
We have.
Python thinks of the number 20.
We've
Python
done
thinks of
that.
Python asks the user for a guess.
We've done that.
Python checks if the number entered is higher, lower, or equal to the number 20.
We've done that.
Python gives feedback to the user.
And we've done that.
Land.
We're done.
Land.
Program done. High salary incoming and a nice weekend on the beach. Awesome. So this is our minimum viable product. If you were to work at a company that tells you to make an MVP for something, you'd make the minimum required to make the product essentially show off what it wants to show off. This is usually done to research a particular thing or to try if something is viable or something is smart to do. And it's pretty common in like developer sprints to do this. And next week, like I said, we're going to refactor this code, which means, like someone already helpfully asked and I responded to, that we're going to take this code and see if we can make it more pretty. So we're going to like look at all these style errors that we got, and we're going to maybe add a couple new things, like I said, maybe a sound effect when you win, things like that. And yeah, that's what we're going to be doing. The homework, like I said earlier, is always going to be on the website. So if you didn't catch it, that's fine. But it's going to be make sure that if you type a word, the program doesn't crash, and make sure that the other thing that I said happens. But essentially, we have our program done at a random number, right? Like make sure it's not always 20 that you have to guess, because otherwise it's boring. So find a way to generate random integers in Python. It's very simple. There's like an import you need to do, and then you use a function call to store the result of that random number into right guess, and that's literally all you need to do. So Google that, see if you can find it, and then for the rest, figure out how to make sure typing a string doesn't break it. Having said that, we are almost at our limit of time, so I'm going to give it one more time for questions, and then we're going to let you get back to your day.
Question: is it possible to configure beeps with Orca?
That is a really good question. I don't think so. I have not used Orca in any way or fashion that is like more advanced than quickly getting where I need to go for a long time. So maybe, but I don't think so, no.
Okay. How do you get all those error tones in VS Code? I love those.
Those are just there. If you have a screen reader running, they should come up once your editor detects some kind of error. Like,
is there, sorry?
You have to like explicitly turn those off if you're a screen reader user. So if you don't have them, then there's just no errors being detected, and that's probably because Python isn't working properly for some reason.
Is there a reason we chose this time of day for webinars with you?
It's not really from me to respond. Like I am 6 hours ahead of most people. It is currently, like I said, 8:23 p.m. here, and I need to go get to dinner soon. So
that's
so
quite,
that was
quite
the
a bit
reason.
of the reason. Yep, there you go.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason. Okay. The next question is from Deborah.
Deborah, go ahead.
After your conditional statement, there's always a colon. What's the colon doing?
It is just Python syntax for here starts a block. You also see it at the beginning of function definitions, for example.
Understood.
I think I got them all. I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait a minute. I see another hand. So
going once, going twice.
I got one more. Lauren.
Hi, can you hear me? I think I muted myself.
Yep, you're audible.
Yes, hi. First of all, I totally, there's a lot I don't understand about this, so I don't know the first thing. But the one thing that I mentioned in the chat, it was about this ABC notation thing called sound cells. It does, I believe, does use Python, but
Very
I don't
cool.
know how to. But I don't know how to incorporate all this into the music notation. Though I would know.
I'm going to, like I said, poke me on something, and I'm going to take a look at it for you.
What's
like there's a class website at zersiax.github.io. That's zersiax.github.io.
ZIR, I'm sorry, spell it again, please.
ZERSIAX. .github.io. That's the class website that has all the things on it.
All right. I wouldn't know the first thing about how to do the assignments. You mentioned assignments. I wouldn't know the first thing because I had no idea.
Yeah, it helps to look at, like, for example, session 3 we did in the Abide playlist on YouTube's, on APH's YouTube channel as well. That's a bit more of an introduction to Python.
Okay. All right. I'll see what I could do. I don't know what the first thing. I mean, you know,
it's understandable. Like, all beginners welcome. Just feel free to ask questions, and I'll see if I can get you unstuck.
Okay. Thank you.
Next question is from Becky.
Okay, so I didn't quite catch what was the first thing you put, like before you put the welcome to, before you welcomed the user.
Right. I did write_guess equals 20.
Aha, that's why. Okay, that's what I wasn't getting. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Next question. Is there a way to create macros in editors like Eclipse, Netbeans, and Visual Studio Code to easily toggle between the editor and the output terminal to make the process less cumbersome?
I mean, you already have one in the form of going to your browse mode or your JAWS virtual cursor and jumping to the previous and next edit field. Like if I go out of here.
No previous clickable terminal 1. Main landmark clickable Python thinks of the number 20. Bullet on clickable terminal 1. Python D.
I can just use Shift E and E to jump between those two places. So it's just a pane that opens. I think you can even do that without going into the browse mode by doing F6.
Terminal 1.
Yes, you can. So once there is a terminal open, you can press F6 to jump between various points of the UI. And you can use Shift F6
main landmark Python thinks of the
to go back where you came from. So that is probably the closest thing to a macro that you can find.
You explained that given a colon begins the blocks, but what ends it?
The lack of indentation. So a colon introduces a block, then you start indenting everything that's part of the block, and then once you stop doing that, the block is over. It's a bit odd at times to begin with, but you get used to it.
It sounds extremely visual.
It can be. It's essentially, once you get used to it with like the reporting on, like I can immediately hear. Let's see if I have it.
Quick input list numbers.py:\.
So I can immediately hear if I even just like with the beeps, I can immediately hear, oh, this is a block, this is not a block, this is a block, this is not a block. So you can really quickly tell where the block ends and where it begins, even audibly once you have these indentation reports enabled. It is visual, but you can certainly learn to make like the most of it and take it to your advantage, which is what I am doing as well. So in that sense, the alternative is having a brace and like a left brace and a right brace encircle a block. That's what some languages do, or other things like that. That is arguably a bit more easy to find. But also if, for example, the left brace is at the end of a line, you'd have to listen to the entire function call before you even get to that left brace. So in this sense, in some respects, this is actually quicker.
I think that sound piece definitely helped, Florian. I don't see any other questions.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's good because we have like 2 minutes before we need to let you all go. And I think Ty really wants to thank our sponsors again, so I'm going to take it over to her.
Thank you. Yes, I do. I want to say thanks to CDW for sponsoring today's class and all of our coding classes. As always, if you have questions between now and the next class, feel free to consult the YouTube playlist of the different courses, different classes we've offered so far. And then also you can use the various contacts that have been provided to get some more information if you have questions.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I am ending it here. I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you guys are super confused. For the people who are new, essentially the way it works is I'm going to add notes about this class up. Should be up around this time tomorrow. I generally announce it both on the Slido as well as on the Discord once I have them up. So you can go look at those when they're done. Yeah, that's pretty much it for today. I hope you guys had fun.
Thank you so much.